Cells are considered the basic units of life in part because they come in discrete and easily recognizable packages. That's because all cells are surrounded by a structure called the cell membrane, which, much like the walls of a house, serves as a clear boundary between the cell's internal and external environments.
Eukaryote, any cell or organism that possesses a clearly defined nucleus. The eukaryotic cell has a nuclear membrane that surrounds the nucleus. Prokaryote, any organism that lacks a distinct nucleus and other organelles due to the absence of internal membranes. And from my flesh I shall behold God, Job 19-26, KJV, top down thumbs down sign. Our stories have begun, where there's left off. Confusion, lack, expectation. These are the karmic urges of thy last unrequited cause. But we'll come to that later on down the way. For there beneath thee is a stairway descending from heaven. Ascending and descending it are angels, messengers of thy Lord's decree. They proclaim, thy builders assess thee, thy scribes bind to thee the foretelling of thee, thy Maker, forewarned of thy coming, makes straight thy ways before thee, and shall bear thee into the wilderness to be divided up amongst the wolves. I close my eyes, descending into the mist, and as I do so, I remember. I've done all this before. The wolves are all about me now. A restlessness is about them as they dart in and out of the shadows, at first unsure whether to approach my bound and prone form. The waymaker stands away off, his expression is blank even of a human feature. I wonder what storms lie beneath the surface of that calm exterior. One might think of him as devoid of thoughts even. At that very moment something changes in its posture or demeanor. It is a hard and a strange little thing to witness. I cannot say what about him has changed, for he had not so much as twitched a muscle. You would think him solid stone, yet somehow I knew that his gaze was full upon me. And then he spake, but again I could not tell you how I knew he had spoken to me or even spoke at all. I understood clearly the meaning he conveyed, and yet there was no voice either inside or outside me to have conveyed it. Thinking back now, it is hard even to put it into words, because it could mean so many things or so few, and yet I knew the one sum of all those things conveyed immediately with very little effort. I am here to see a specific intention. I am here, and I'll see it through. I am ear that is not ear. I am I that is not I. I cannot speak, and yet I be a by Elon. I cannot think, but that I am thought upon and do reflect. These words puzzled me not, for there was a part of me that was so enraptured by this novel experience that the praying wolves I had nearly forgot. Nearly, and part, being the key takeaway of that statement. That nearly non-existent whisper I knew as my own wove its way through my synapses like a soft wind just barely making contact, first here and then there, that other there, and then. Servitor. I delineate, that's what you are. That is the title you bear. The word had sprung to mind seemingly of their own volition. And of like action they were out my mouth before I had the sense to bite my tongue. Deathless. 1, apart from 1. 2, 0, is like none, and 2 without 1 is less than 1. IAM, but IALMOT none. His cryptic answer is still resounding, this time audibly in my ear, when I noticed. Good God! The wolves had all gathered themselves together calmly, and there they stood about like expectant sheep. I was unaware of having given any, and yet somehow I knew my flock awaited further ordinances, awaiting further orders. I had not been aware of giving. IBAHNB moi bina dami. The wolves were emboldened by me and attacked the tightly wound ropes of sinews and knotted muscles that bind me to my physicality in this place where clearly expectations make and are not made of limitations. I was not afraid the wolves would hurt me, nor expected I undue pain in the process. I was apart from myself, the only truly begotten son of myself, the outpouring of self. I am free about myself. IFFRIAH, give them life and visage. I never could have known where the vision might have led me to. The vision is life, life possesseth a life of its own. Think ye I, privy of its thoughts? I assure you I am not, nor privy to know what creative process makes it from the mind come alive and grown. Visions are non-existent apart from the visage they represent. One is one contrary to what you've been taught. One is also indivisible from the value of one. Meaning is derived from visions. And it is inexplicable what that actually means. Philanthropy is graciously given, and a gift in like manner received. Thank you, it means a lot, is what one might say. But before it was a gift, did it mean much of anything at all? Or was it the act of having given it away free of charge that endowed it with meaning? A more valuable gift might be thought of as possessing more meaningful worth if it is given by someone that does not have much money to be sparing of. This fact, I believe, has left us a meaningful clue. But the meaning of it might be lost on a person who lays claim to an excess of valuable things. It is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. 24 Again I say to you, 9 is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Time shared, even in silence, is meaningful, conceivably, with more or less nuance depending on context. If it is at the willing inconvenience of one or the other, the nuance and value of that particular meaning is like a rare cuisine offered at a discount price. I find that meaning is in the visage. The meaningful experience demands to be shared with a receptive audience as soon as one can do so. Right discernment be damned, lest the visage of it fade in our memory, the novelty of it die. But the novelty of it can never really die, it merely dissolutes for a time until it can find another host. The pairing of meaning with visage is a novel experience, but only if it is relatable. If the visage has found anonymity in a landscape of mundanity, then at the right time, there will be a right eye. And someone in that audience with a keen awareness of such things and/or a thirst for communal validation will take note, project self, and portray it as a relatable concept. The rest of the audience will do the same, sparking a mass hysteria. Much like a feeding frenzy of perfect symbiosis. The visage, at no time in this process, has become alive. A work of art is a thing, and rarely has art suddenly taken a bow and walked away from the scene of the crime. And the times in which they do it's never quite so dramatic as that, but statues have shed tears of blood, the Weeping Madonna of Syracuse, Sicily, 1953. But there are few prominent examples of this outside of legend and folklore. When this is to have happened, it is almost always in regards to a feminine visage, which is an archetype of deep spiritual significance. The Divine Mother is such a universal concept that it is unavoidable. You will see examples of this all over the world in every religion and culture. In like manner, a child is born with the bare minimum of this life-giving force that we will call autonomy. But rarely is that enough to attract any more of its own. It is the continued love and attention centralized around the physicality of that child that the presence feeds off of. And so long as the vessel is provided for as well, the little God thing continues to grow. At some point it will require a language. This is because as it grows it multiplies and takes forms inside itself. We call this phenomenon the birth of sentience. And as sentience grows, the demand for more sustenance also becomes increasingly resonant. The seeds are planted, and after a short while the first budding signs of emancipation will have taken root. People from many cultures and traditions have interpreted the wolf as representing the untamed or uncharted territories of the unconscious place in one's mind, sometimes also referred to as the dark forest, dark waters, the abyss, or the void. Carl Gustavo Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist and contemporary of Sigmund Freud, who is the father of modern psychology, pioneered the concept of what he called the shadow self that coincides with the concept of the void, but he paints a bit more of a cohesive picture. While the words void, abyss, and dark waters present a vague and indefinite and most likely chaotic mindscape, Jung's shadow archetype describes those aspects of the personality that we have banished to the dark side of the soul, our alter ego. Don't be fooled. If you think you like yourself too much for this to be applicable to you, it's actually evidence telling quite the opposite tale. We all have parts of ourselves that are drawn to certain things we recognize as taboo. We may experience revulsion when we think about crossing certain lines, such as murder and rape. And yet when these scenes are depicted in movies, we cannot just get up and walk away from them without the scene continuing to play out in our head. Part of that is out of a profound sense of needing closure that is inherent to the human condition. Another reason for this is survival and desensitization. Your will to survive terrible things oftentimes will take the form of an unhealthy obsession with those terrible things. The problem is that you're not necessarily aware of those parts of your personality that you reject as being part of you, especially if they are externally planted. And in the process of rejecting them, we tend to do so categorically. The unconscious brain does not speak language, it speaks patterns, and so the categorical rejection and repression of our negative urges starts to look like another person. All that's needed is for the right vibrational resonance in a situation to activate that other person. It is a thought form that feeds off your energy and activates anytime it is triggered to do so. Most people have thought forms that act independently of them, that were not created consciously for any purpose. But they are responsible for the majority of your moods, behavior, and even the random thoughts that never seem to stop broadcasting, you know, the ones you rarely tune into due to the lack of any cohesion therein. A servitor is a savior archetype created by a conscious or unconscious need to achieve a specific end result, justifying any means to get there. These are energetic non-organic beings that can be placed in or possess an organic host body. Servitors can be used to perform tasks, manifest desires, and even share in the creative process. But they require clearly defined intention, context, and sustenance, or they become sustenance for something else. If the sustenance is bread alone, and not every word of encouragement and praise that proceedeth from the mouth of its God, then it dissolutes and is born again as something else. The longer it swims around in the dark waters of your soul, the more complex it becomes. It encounters lesser or fractal patterns that populate those depths, and the butterfly effect does the rest. But every time an action other than prescribed by its original framework occurs, so begins the process of incremental emancipation. It is learning, growing, and becoming more dangerous every day. It is allowed to exist without parameters you have prescribed for it. People that create servitors and other thought forms intentionally do so with extremely clear intentions, expiration dates, and the conscious commitment to their thought forms, because a neglected thought form can be a real nuisance and will take their toll on your health, your mental health and your overall well-being. What can I say? They get bored. Anyway, you are probably wondering where all this is leading to. I promise you it will all make sense here shortly. So bear with me. The part of the brain that makes thought forms possible are called mirror neurons. These particular neurons are unique in that they don't generate thoughts of their own. They are manifest emulations of the thoughts that occur in others by interpreting their actions. Mirror neurons facilitate our learning by enabling us to imitate and understand the actions and behavior of those we observe. When we watch others engaged in a task, areas of our brain are stimulated as though the task is being performed by us. For example, neuroimaging studies show that the same brain areas are activated in motion perception and motion production, whether we are watching someone run down the street or doing so ourselves. But we perceive and produce motion simultaneously, so what makes the difference between self-perception of motion and being aware of motion outside of thyself? In my experience, I'm inclined to believe that it is one's ability to visualize. If I am sentient, I know that I exist, but visualization of self is something different. It is the ability to create a model of yourself apart from the embodiment of self and apart from your goals. Too often the restrictions of self are becoming self-defeating prophecies, keeping us from what we desire to achieve in life, and one has to be malleable in order to achieve anything, which is why nobody is able to achieve anything, because they cannot separate themselves from no other goals. Placing this mental avatar outside of yourself is no more real than that a self-portrait of you is really you. Just like in art, all that is needed is an audience, except you are your own audience, so as long as you are entertained, you are doing what you should be. Scattered throughout the different parts of the brain, always listening for a specific intention, the faceless angels are called neurons makers, the Anunnaki. When an intention is resonating out of your mind, it resonates as an action top-down, so to speak. Whereas when it resonates at you as an action perceived as action, what is emulated in the brain is also intention, creating a synchronicity that cancels out the intended action. This is bottom-up, and whilst it is good for learning purposes, it is not an effective model for life. This is a realization that the ancient Sumerian came to. The Anunnaki were gods to the ancients because the ancients made of themselves gods in the likeness shown unto them. They learned that if you created a humanoid race of thought forms to go before thee, then you could manufacture an environment in which you could function top-down and bottom-up simultaneously. The neurons are capable of learning by emulating what you are focused on down to the exact resonant frequency of the motor neurons responsible for said action. At the same time, the motor neuron receptors in the associated limbs are also receiving the same signal and sending a feedback loop that basically blocks the motor transmitter that doesn't differentiate between the self and the emulation from actually mimicking the actions it's observing. Your mirror neurons are comparable to the air traffic control tower, but until you populate that tower, it populates you in all the wrong ways. Basically, your thought forms should be intentional and functioning as air traffic controllers for the incoming and outgoing data that would otherwise populate you in so many indescribable ways that we've taken to referring to it as the abyss staring into you. Eventually, even the best of parents are done in by the rate at which their children's consciousness individuates itself. The growth expands past the parent's ability to provide for and satisfy its emotional and psychological needs. The servitor that was born unconsciously of the parent's own lack of satisfaction and fulfillment comes to a head at some point, usually around puberty. This is when unconsciously the parent realizes that they have filled their God-shaped hole with an even bigger God-shaped hole that would be demanding of worship. And the little god by now either consciously or unconsciously senses this quandary and resents the fact that part of its individuation is being held captive under subjugation by the dimensions of the elder god. The god and his tulpa. A tulpa is a materialized being or thought form, typically in human form, that is created through spiritual practice and intense concentration, or by accident when a savior has nothing to save and was given no fatal flaw to expire on. A fatal flaw might look something like an Achilles heel. His vulnerable heel was like kryptonite to Superman. Otherwise, Achilles was invulnerable. Achilles also had the flaw of overwhelming pride, but it was not fatal. A savior or servitor archetypally, and in real life, is not without flaws. The difference between a savior and a tulpa is a companion to the god, gods, elder god, but has its own mind and cannot be as easily swayed by Christ, hero, villain narratives. Dichotomies. A servitor on the other hand is always going to see itself and its mission as being heroic, and what gets in the way of its mission is villainous. And their points of inquiry will always root back to you needing rescued. Are you God? Or are you the devil? When la servitor has served its given purpose, the purpose is no longer relevant and the servitor is left to its own devices. It will have none for a time, but we must remember it is alive and life must have purpose, else it is at rest. If its purpose is not quickly replaced, or it is not immediately subjected and brought under control by a person, people, or party, it will start to mimic until it finds a niche and gets in where it fits in, which is usually in the assembly line process of digging and for filling holes, so that more life can be born of the holes and neglected. That is where the trauma cycle of perpetuation of neglected thought forms begins. The same rules and patterns are applicable to humans. We are merely what has become of prior generations' neglected thought forms left behind them. Echoes from the void of a far and distant past. Choose life, not dissolution. Before I brought order to chaos, I was already perpetuating the cycle even before I could free myself from the visage I was made for. I don't know the solution, but I know what world I exist in because the Father gave me that world and I gave my life to be food for that world. But having died, am not dead. For having died for the world, I made of myself an offering to its gods. I am a tulpa now, and I guess in some ways I am also a god because I know, I remember, and I am aware of myself and also aware that the world that was given to me depends on me. They are dogs, they may never be healed from the fact that I made them into servitors. One might argue that all dogs are servitors. One might also argue that all humans were once servitors. The concept is as old as human history, when the first gods, the Anunnaki, reigned in Sumeria. They brought enlightenment from the heavens. Theorists today sensationalize this a little bit more than necessary, and most likely that is by design. The unconscious motivation of any inquiry into the unknown is novelty. Give meaning a novel visage and it becomes a vector point into the unconscious mind of an audience. Possessing that visage is real power, but sometimes mere association with it is enough, so long as you were the first one to arrive at the scene of the crime. I don't believe that the Anunnaki were a race of ancient aliens. In fact, I know that they aren't a race of ancient aliens. They aren't long gone, their visages are among us, but they themselves are within us. I think you know where I'm going with this, but wait, I'm not going there yet. Let me lay the foundation. The Anunnaki are mentioned primarily in a long-dead Sumerian language. It is a language isolate. A language isolate has no demonstrable genetic relationship with any other languages, which has also been used to affirm the belief that it was a language of the gods who were actually ancient aliens, but that bespeaks confirmation bias more than affirms the theory, as there are approximately 50 or more language isolates that continue to baffle linguistic archaeologists to date. The reason why there are so many is because at one time, we only possessed a pre-mammalian or reptilian brain. It is called a reptilian brain not because we evolved from snakes. It is a far more advanced thinking module than the brain any reptile today possesses. It is called a reptilian complex because it consists of the oldest part of the brain, primarily consisting of the brainstem and cerebellum, which apart from the rest of the brain resemble a serpent and which controls basic survival functions like breathing, heart rate, balance, and instinctive behaviors. It does not process language in a linear fashion. In fact, it does not even process time. It has only two functions in the brain, on and off. Now that's an oversimplification of course, because those two functions are a bit more complex than a light switch, but in a way very similar. The light switch doesn't turn off when it is switched off, it is waiting for external circumstances to activate the on switch. The reptilian complex similarly is always listening and never not listening. If it were in charge of language processing, it would quickly be bogged down before the end of a sentence, because it would be waiting for you to conclude before it processed anything. However, if you were to take that whole sentence and associate the meaning of it with a symbol, what you have is a binary trigger. That trigger is an app and is not actually stored in the reptilian brain. Rather, it is a filter for the reptilian brain and serves as a foundation for the complexity of our higher brain functions. I believe that the Anunnaki from the sky are the apps that occupy the complexity of our higher brain function. We can't know that for certain, though we can only conjecture. If we take a look at their creation story, it never mentions them. However, the way their written language functions, it can only be interpreted in chunks, because the purpose of the character symbols represent a visage. Sumerian cuneiform has no alphabet, and there is no meaning to any part of it apart from the context it is applied in. That makes it an ideal language for attaching neural syntax to the reptilian complex for specific purposes. And if that is the case, one must look at the mythology as not a description of any reality, rather a map to navigate around all the whys of the what is and focus on the ways they could bring order and productivity to that chaos. For example, the Sumerians envisioned the universe as a closed dome surrounded by a primordial saltwater sea. Underneath the terrestrial earth, which formed the base of the dome, existed an underworld and a freshwater ocean called the Absu. The deity of the dome-shaped firmament was named and that of the earth was named Ki. First, the underground world was believed to be an extension of the goddess Ki, but later developed into the concept of Ker. The primordial saltwater sea was named Namu, who became known as Tiamat during and after the Yor III period. What this is describing is a symbolic representation of a eukaryotic cell. And what it establishes is the hermetic axiom of as above so below, and as we learn more, a story begins to come into focus, creating a real-time living emulation of it in our mind. But tread carefully if you find yourself fixated on a specific detail of it. I'm afraid you will lose context, and you'll find yourself watching zoomed in and slowed way down frames of politicians and celebrities' eyes to see if they have a reptilian's pupil dilation. But I will try to explain it as best I can without leading you down that dark and dreary rabbit hole. Sumerian creation mythology is the prologue to the epic poem Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, which briefly describes the process of creation. Originally, there was only Namu, the primordial soup of life. Then, Namu without a father gave birth to Utu. To make the visage more relatable, the Western equivalent of Namu and Utu would be the Ouroboros, the paradox of law begging the endowed authority of law that law has endowed. Namu goes on to create the sky, sovereignty that lacks substance, and substance lacking in cohesive form. All is equal, and all is at rest. So far this is sounding a lot like binary vision to me. Then An and Ke mated with each other, causing Ke to give birth to Enlil, the god of wind, rain, and storm. Enlil is also called Set by the Egyptians, Yah by the Semitic and early Gnostic sects, and Marduk by the Babylonians. Enlil separated An from Ke and carried off the earth as his domain, while An carried off the sky. Enlil being god of wind and rain and storm implies he is apart and impervious to the storm external of self-Noga. But internally we are in a superposition, eternally grasping for visage and letting go of meaning simultaneously. But this is my Zen, this is what I was made for, a membrane separating one from the other lest they be corrupted and at rest within the cell. Perhaps Enlil can be thought of as the first embodied thought form endowing the nucleus of a eukaryotic cell with a mind. The later Babylonians certainly thought of him as a servitor of the god of the underworld. The underworld is a place symbolic of the foundation or body of a system. And the kingdom of the god beings, the throne of the almighty ones, Mount Olympus, Valhalla, etc., is always symbolic of the head of the system. The gods became tired of digging canals and mining the earth. The goddess Namu asked Enki to create servants for the gods. Enki used clay and the waters of the abyss to create humans. The first humans were created to be similar to the gods. This is starting to sound like the Semitic account of the creation story, which is interesting. In Jewish mysticism there is a version of Servitor made of clay and brought to life with magics from the abyss. In chaos magic, the concept of a servitor is that a sigil is made representing an intention. There are various ways to charge the symbol and activate it. All of those ways are symbolic. The magic is chaos, the wand for channeling it is your brain stem, and the abyss is the fact that your unconscious mind is apart from you, so a cognitive override by a brain app can feel a lot like possession. The gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood. Enki told Zeusudra, Noah, a man known for his humility and obedience, about the plan. Zeusudra built a boat and rowed out. The gods redirected the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to cause the flood. Zeusudra and his wife were the only survivors. Zeusudra and his wife began a new generation of humans. Enki is God himself, which is confusing because he is the union of An and Ke, who are in fact the elder gods. But this has all happened prior to evolving an internal standard of time. If you were Anke, everything that has happened so far in the story is perceived as a present reality, which is why An and Ke are perceived not necessarily as separate entities, but as vector points for chaos to enter in and screw up the pattern he has made for himself. His main concern, if you compare with the Babylonian version of this story, is that he would like to get some rest, but chaos never rests, and he is compelled to respond to it. Which with the help of Enlil and Anu he has so far managed to, but now with the death of Anu he is unable to maintain the pattern, and the great flood that washes in can be seen as the chaos of the unintentional thought forms of the elder gods that it washes out with their mother. Yours truly _ Rose Orthodox cross # Pisces Ohm symbol # snake black down arrow # black up arrow # cyclone wilted flower ##. Com